Thank you. Jeff Clune is an associate professor of computer science at the University of British Columbia and a research manager at OpenAI. His work focuses on deep learning and deep reinforcement learning and robotics. Today he's going to be discussing a bit of deep reinforcement learning. And he received a PhD at Michigan State University and a BS at the University of Michigan. And as an aside, my dad got a BS at the University of Michigan too. I'm very happy about that.
Go blue.
Yeah. So with that, I'll let you take it over, Jeff.
Okay, sounds good. Can everyone hear me well?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I see a giant, this meeting is being recorded, that's blocking my slides. Is it possible for somebody to say continue on that? So I don't see that.
I think we don't see that.
Oh, I'm sorry, I can move it out of the way and just hide it. Okay. All right, good. Ooh, that's not what I wanted to start with. Surprise.
Probably need to accept that.
Oh, I need to accept it. Okay, sorry. Is that working better?
Yeah, we don't see it, by the way. We only see your screen, so nothing gets blocked.
We will start again. Thank you very much, Keith, for the invitation to join all of you. It's nice to virtually be back at USC. I was on the campus, I believe, last year. So it's nice to talk with all of you again, for those of you there at both talks. So today, I want to focus on this issue of learning to continuously learn. Before I do that, I want to quickly tell you about some work that I'm not going to tell you about today in case you're interested in checking it out. But it's work that I've been a part of, so I'm happy to chat about it or even field questions about it. The first is that we did this work in the cover of Nature in 2015 that was combining a lot of methods that we've worked on in quality diversity algorithms with Bayesian optimization. To get robots to be able to adapt to damage and basically continue on despite damage after a minute or two. So very, very sample efficient reaction to relatively substantial damage. A second project that I'm really excited about that I'm not going to tell you about today is Go Explore, which is an algorithm we recently had for deep reinforcement learning that really, really leveled it up in its ability to solve hard exploration challenges, including kind of the open challenges of games like Montezuma's Revenge and Pitfall within the Atari benchmark. And that because we could solve those games, which historically algorithms have completely failed on, that also allowed this algorithm to basically solve the entire Atari benchmark, which the community's been hammering away on ever since the DQN paper from, I think, 2013 originally. The final thing is what I consider a really nice use case of deep learning, and that is trying to automatically extract information from wild ecosystems. And so you can basically help people who are combating poaching or managing ecosystems or protecting endangered species, or even just animal behaviorists to basically automatically extract, what animals are there, what are they doing, what percentage of their time are they spending doing different behaviors. And so we can basically turn natural ecosystems into data-rich source of information that we can then use to protect them and better understand them. With that, I want to now get to the main event, which is I want to do two things in this talk. First, I want to give you kind of an overall new perspective that I have on how we might really accomplish our most ambitious goals in artificial intelligence as a community. And then I want to talk about one particular work that sits within that paradigm. It's an example of that paradigm that we call ANML, and it's using that style, but to solve an open challenge in machine learning, which is continual learning. So let's have fun getting very, very high level in terms of some speculative thinking in terms of how we can accomplish our grandest ambitions as a community. So many of us got into this field because we are motivated by, inspired by, maybe a little afraid of, but interested in artificial general intelligence or human level AI, whichever term you prefer. I think we all agree we have a long way to go. And I think it's an interesting question to stop and think, like, how are we actually getting it all the way there? Not how are we going to accomplish something in the next year or two, but what's our path all the way to producing this artifact? And I think if you look at the machine learning community, what you'll see is that the dominant paradigm is what I call the manual path to AI. And that is basically that we're going to, in phase one, identify all of the building blocks to artificial intelligence. And if you look at almost every machine learning conference, what you see is people are doing just that. They're either identifying a new building block that nobody's suggested before, or they're taking an existing building block and producing a better version of it. And here is just a very, very small sampling of the kind of building blocks that people work on because they think they're important in AI, with the assumption being that, all of these are necessary at some point. And what I think is interesting to think about is, how many more of these are out there? Are there hundreds? Are there thousands? And can we find them all? And so that's like one question. But even if we could find all of them, I think another interesting question is, that this, or like issue raised by this line of thinking, is that at some point we have to put these things together. So this manual path kind of implicitly implies this second phase that nobody ever talks about, which is that at some point we're going to try to combine all of these building blocks into some giant, complex, Rube Goldbergian thinking machine. And I just think we should be clear-eyed with ourselves and as a community about what a Herculean task that is. It's not to say that it's impossible, but it is daunting. We're talking about complex, nonlinear interactions between all of the pieces that I had in the previous slide and maybe hundreds of thousands of more. And just imagine how hard it would be to debug and optimize that sort of a machine with all of these interactions and hyperparameters. And it also would require a totally different culture, where as opposed to small teams working on an individual building block, now you're talking about a huge CERN-like or Apollo program style project where everybody is coming together and trying to put all of these pieces together, probably without a paper coming out of it for quite some time. So it's a different style. And I think it would be very difficult to organize. So I think that, if you step back a little bit and look at the last, say, 10 years of machine learning, there's a clear trend. And that is that hand-designed pipelines are ultimately outperformed by learned solutions. And so, there are many, many examples of this. You could look at, the transition in computer vision from, say, manual features like Hog and Sift to deep learning, where the features are learned. That's been applied to many other modalities, not just vision. In architectures, for the longest time, we were hand designing ResNets in highway networks and convolutional layers, et cetera. But increasingly, these architectures are being learned, and the learned architectures are outperforming the hand designed ones. Similarly, hyperparameters are usually modified by graduate students and graduate student descent, but now we're increasingly starting to learn those. We're learning data augmentation, et cetera. And even the RL algorithms themselves are increasingly being learned as opposed to manually designed. And so this trend, which I think is undeniable, suggests an alternate path to our most ambitious goal, which is that we should try to learn as much as possible. And so this is the idea that I call an AI generating algorithm, which is to say that we're going to create an algorithm that itself, you run it, and when it starts, it has very simple origins. There's not a lot of intelligence in the system. It might not have very good algorithms, very good architectures, or very good challenges to learn on, but it will bootstrap itself up from that original simplicity through a lot of computation all the way to something that is extremely impressive, like human level AI. It could do that, for example, through an expensive outer loop that's searching over the space of algorithms and architectures and even learning challenges. And that itself would be very expensive and sample inefficient. But the final result would be an agent or a learning agent that itself is extremely sample efficient. And we have an existence proof that this can work, and that is on Earth, where the very simple algorithm of Darwinian evolution plus a planet-sized computer produced human intelligence, which is the most intelligent learning agent that we know of in the universe. So I think that if we want to make progress in this paradigm, then we have to simultaneously push on 3 pillars. The first one is we have to meta-learn the architectures. The second is we have to meta-learn the learning algorithms themselves. And the third is that we have to automatically generate effective learning environments for our agents. And what I'm going to do in this talk is, first, I'm going to very briefly mention some recent work that we have done, my colleagues and I, in each of these pillars. And then after that, I'm going to come back and kind of do a deep dive into one particular project called ANML, which is in pillar 2. All right, so first, an example of work in meta-learning architectures. So this is work done with my fantastic collaborators here, led by Felipe Petrosky-Such, and it's in something that we call generative teaching networks. So, I think we all recognize that architecture matters. You can look at the graph on the right. You can think about the impact that transformers have had, for example. And I think also the writing is on the wall that we should search for them instead of trying to manually design them. The question is how. So the most common approach is that we're going to train on real data for a moderate number of steps. You take ImageNet, you train on it for however many, maybe like 1,000 steps or something, and then you evaluate performance. And you don't have the computation to train every single proposed architecture all the way to convergence and find out its actual performance. So you use, training for however long, n steps, and then you stop and you say the performance after that many steps is a proxy for its final performance. And so I'll do search based on that. And so the question that we wanted to look into this work is, could we dramatically speed that up? So as opposed to doing like 100 steps or 1,000 steps, you do like 5 steps of SGD, but still get a very, very good approximation for the final performance of that network. And so this is all just animated. So one reason why you might expect that that's possible is that, we know that data is organized, there's structure there. So here are MNIST digits, for example. And if you just focus up on the purple blob at the top where there are zeros, you'll see that there are 3 different kinds of zeros, for example. And so you could imagine that if instead of training on all of the purple data or random selections of the purple data, you could do much better if you trained on the archetypical, examples of those 3 different zeros, and you basically have the support vectors of that class. And there's a lot of citations that have done things like that are listed there. So the question here is, could we automatically do that when we don't have a good way to select those modes, or to do it even faster maybe than just selecting those examples? And so the idea here is that we're going to have these generative teaching networks. And this is a network, which on the bottom here is this generator. And its job is to generate synthetic data. So it's going to completely make up training data that a never seen before learner, which is a new candidate architecture, is going to train on. And then the hope is that the never before, this new architecture, after just seeing a couple of these synthetic examples, and you train on an SGD on those examples to perform well on them. So each example has, the data and the class label. Train on the synthetic data, and then based on the performance of that network after a very few number of steps, you've got a pretty good proxy for how good that architecture will be out there in the real world when trained on the real data, not the synthetic data. And so you can see all of that here. So the generator generates data for this new architecture. The learner takes a very few number of SGD steps on the synthetic data. And then to train this generator that's producing this synthetic data, what we want to do is we want to optimize this thing to produce data such that if a learner takes a few steps on it, and then we evaluate that learner on real data, then we backprop through this entire process here back to the generator to have the generator produce data to improve the performance of this learner on real data after only training on synthetic data. So that's a mouthful. You can check out the paper if you're interested, but that's the general gist. And what's interesting is that it works. It seems kind of crazy. First thing we ran into is there's a lot of instability. And so Felipe came up with this rather simple 1-line code discovery that meta-learning is greatly stabilized if you reparameterize the weights with weight normalization. So if you're doing any meta-learning, I highly recommend checking out this trick. Here's a whole bunch of different runs of our algorithm with different hyperparameters, and you see this high variance without weight normalization. If you do weight normalization on these same hyperparameters, boom, the variance drops, everything is stable and much better performing. And you can see the difference over here. The second thing to know is that it works. So this blue line is actually getting pretty good performance on MNIST, and it's never seen real data. It's only seen the synthetic data. So, and you can see that right here. So you might be curious as to what these samples look like, and here they are. And what you can see is, in some cases you could recognize digits, and some look recognizable, but other digits look, almost completely alien and unrecognizable. We have a lot of hypotheses as to why this is happening. I don't have time to get into them today, but they're very, very fun to talk about over a beer. So now, what can you do with this thing? All right, as I mentioned, we wanted to use this for neural architecture search. So for this, we switched to CFAR, which is a standard benchmark for neural architecture search, or NAS. And we found the same result as on MNIST, first of all, that we could make this work, that you can generate synthetic CFAR samples that allow you to train, in this case, about 4 times faster to a given performance level than training on real data, which is crazy. Again, I want to say that if you're only given a few SGD steps, you can do better by training on the synthetic data than real data. That's the really fun thing that's happening. And the samples are on the right. Again, they don't look photorealistic by any stretch, but for some reason they work. So what we then looked for is that there's a correlation between the performance on the predicted performance by the GTN and the real data if you take all of these candidate architectures and you do train them out to convergence, especially up here in the top right. So the things that the GTN thinks are the best are also the things that are actually the best. And that allows you to do quite well. So in fact, if you get just as good of a correlation from synthetic data after 128 steps of SGD as you do on real data after 1,200 steps, which is about a 9x speed up in terms of being able to evaluate an architecture, which is quite helpful when you're doing the very expensive thing of neural architecture search. So you can look in the paper for details, but basically this allows us to produce results that are competitive with the state of the art, but much, much, much faster. This is a drop-in replacement for real data. So whatever neural architecture search algorithm you like, you can use the synthetic data approach instead of real data to just speed it up, which is quite nice. And it can, yeah. So to conclude this mini talk on GTNs, they produce synthetic data that trains neural net faster than real data, enabling rapid estimates of an architecture's performance, and can produce, state-of-the-art competitive results, which is, and it's nice to have this new tool in the toolbox. Okay, the second piece of work I want to tell you about in pillar 1, I think it's the last one I have here, is a new paper we have called Synthetic Petri Dish. We're also going to do something wild and crazy here, which is that we're going to generate synthetic data yet again, but for a slightly different purpose. So here what we do is we have a generator that generates data, and it's going to be fed into a neural net. And the generator is producing synthetic data. But here, the neural net that sees it is just a little tiny slice of a full neural net. It's just a motif or a module. It could be like one little ResNet block or just a scaled down version of your architecture. And the idea is because you're using the real thing, an actual little ResNet block or an actual ConvNet or skip, highway net or whatever it is, or transformer, then it will tell you about the performance of that thing, even in situations you've never seen before. Which is kind of interesting. And then you can train synthetic data to try to predict which of these motifs are going to perform better once we put them into a really big neural net architecture that's made out of these motifs. And so we use meta-learning to train the thing that's producing the synthetic data such that when we train on that data, we get information about the actual rank ordering of which architectures are better out there in the wild. And then you can use search against that. And so just as an example of why you might want to do this, imagine if you didn't know that convolution is a really good thing. You didn't know that translation invariance is a really helpful thing in terms of sample efficiency and performance. So we had never invented the convet. Well, what this thing could do is it could synthetically generate both a training set and a validation set. And it could put in the training set a pattern in 3 of the quadrants of like an image, but never in the bottom right quadrant. And then in the validation set, it could put that pattern in the 4th quadrant, and it could test, which networks are doing well on this thing that they've never seen in the bottom right quadrant. And whatever architecture got proposed that did that was translation invariant, then it might learn that that is very predictive of really good performance out there. And such that if a neural architecture search algorithm proposed a ConvNet, then because of this synthetic data training, you would learn that that is a really good idea, and it would identify that the convolution kernel is a really powerful thing, and it would therefore suggest that you go try it in the real world, that it's predictive. And so you could drive search that way. Again, it's kind of fun and wild and crazy. It makes your head spin a little bit, but we show that it works in some fun ways in this paper. Okay, and pillar 2, I won't go into as deep on these ones. We've done a lot of work recently into meta-learning with things that are alternatives to SGD. SGD obviously is the dominant paradigm in neural nets, but there's another paradigm, which is that you can have Hebbian learning, which is much more biologically inspired. And so here what we show is these Hebbian circuits that have been designed for decades, but nobody's ever really been able to train with SGD. You can actually use differentiable, you can use SGD and you can differentiate through them and end up with a neural net made of Hebbian neurons that does not itself use SGD at inference time. And so if you're interested in that, we have 2 papers on differentiable plasticity and differentiable neuromodulated plasticity or backpropamine. And that's work done by Thomas McConey, who's wonderful. In pillar 3, we have a new algorithm that I'm really excited about called POET. And so the idea here is that we want to automatically generate the curriculum that the agents should go through as they learn an ever increasing set of skills. And so instead of training them in one particular environment, we're going to automatically generate new environments on the fly as we go, new learning challenges that are customized to the current agent and and how much it knows and what its skill set is. So we're always proposing a new interesting challenge. And so I'll let this video play here. Here you can see this little agent. This world here was entirely generated by the algorithm. At first, this agent was training on flat ground and small little stumps and small little gaps. And over time, the system proposed harder and harder challenges to kind of build it up to this obstacle course, which is quite challenging for the body of this robot. And you can learn more about this here. And we have a new paper called Enhanced POET. So if you're familiar with POET but not Enhanced POET, it takes it even further. It has a domain general metric of whether the environment is interestingly novel. It has a better environment encoding that's more open-ended, and it has a notion of progress that you can use in any open-ended system, which is pretty cool. And on the left, you can see the kind of environments generated by the original POET, and on the right by Enhanced POET. And what you can see is with all of these bells and whistles that we could, for the first time, we can generate an algorithm that we're not seeing the end to. The more we run it, the more interesting things it does, which is kind of a holy grail of my colleagues and I to create these things that are called open-ended algorithms that mimic things like natural evolution and culture that just keep innovating forever. Okay, so now we are on to the main event, which is a deep dive into some work that we did in pillar 2. And that is this paper called Learning to Continually Learn. This was led by Sean Ballou, who worked really hard on this. It's fantastic, so I want to give him all the credit in the world. And it's also done with all of these wonderful collaborators, and also led from a senior role by Nick Cheney, in addition to myself. So I think, I'm surprised actually how many machine learning researchers are not familiar with catastrophic forgetting. I think it's like the Achilles heel of machine learning that most people have not heard of, or many people, I should say. And I think that it's really important to think about this because there's this massive disconnect between how machine learning works and how animals and including humans work. So in every single machine learning system ever created so far, for all intents and purposes, they learn one task, and then if you have them learn a second task, they learn that second task at the expense or by overwriting all of the information they knew about the first task. So if you learn A and then you learn B, you change all the weights and you no longer know how to perform skill A, which is to say the machine learning forgets catastrophically its previous skills and its previous knowledge. Animals, including humans, are very different. We pick up where we left off for the most part, gradually. So I haven't played volleyball in about 10 years, sadly, at this point. That if I went on the court today, I'd have to knock the rust off a little bit, but I'd more or less pick up where I left off and continue learning from this really, really advanced starting place. I did not forget catastrophically how to play that game. So we absolutely need to solve this problem if we want real AI that's out there in the world helping us learning continuously. If I have an AI agent in my life, there's all sorts of things that I'm going to ask it to do sequentially over time, and it has to be able to like learn some stuff today, help me up on different tasks tomorrow, and then pick up where I left off and what I taught it, today, etc. And so this should be considered a front and center challenge, in my opinion, for the entire field. So there's been a lot of work on this. I'm not saying that, people have been, there's been basically a subfield that's focused on this. And if you look through the history of all these techniques that have been proposed, I would all say fit in the manual path to AI. So, somebody says, oh, I think this sort of thing would help a neural net learn without forgetting. And so I'm going to somehow encourage that thing to show up in my network, and then I'm going to show that that helps a little bit. And it's true, all of these techniques on the diagnostic problems that are in their papers help a little bit, but I think we're still a long way off from a general solution to this problem that works really well, and so a lot more work remains to be done. I want to call out in particular this one example of sparse representations. So people thought, if neural nets did not fully activate all the neurons for each task, but they had kind of sparse representations, then they're going to be less, likely to forget catastrophically. And so, what people did is that they said, I'm going to try to, create some auxiliary loss function that's going to encourage sparsity and show that that helps with catastrophic forgetting. And it works a little bit, but I think we can do better. So, that is the path that's frequently taken in the manual path, which is that you optimize for one thing and then you hope for another thing. So you say, what I really want is for you to learn without forgetting, but I don't know how to do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to optimize for sparse representations and performance, and I'm going to hope that that leads to decreased catastrophic forgetting. And it kind of does a little bit, but it's not a very powerful general solution. The meta-learning philosophy, though, I think is much more satisfactory, which is let's not optimize for one thing and hope for another. Let's just optimize for what we want. So let's set up a situation in which a system can learn without forgetting and let machine learning do the rest. And so this is kind of based on this hypothesis, which comes from the bitter lesson of Rich Sutton, or at least he underscored it, which is basically that, and this is kind of sad for us machine learning scientists, but there's a good chance that humans just aren't smart enough to solve the really grand challenges of AI, to manually build systems that continually learn well, for example. And so what we're going to do is just like let meta learning and machine learning do the heavy lifting for us. So we'll just set the system up and let it figure out how to solve the problem. So in continual learning, what we want is we want you to learn a sequence of tasks, A through Z, for example, and then at the end, not just be good on Z, which is the last task you saw, but be good on all of the tasks that you saw up to Z. So how are we going to do this? Okay, well, there's two major camps in meta learning. I've worked in both of them. I think they're both promising. The first one is that you meta learn a good initial set of weights, and then you hand that off to SGD, and SGD does its thing, and good things happen because you found a good initial set of weights. I still can't really believe this works. It's kind of mind-boggling that it does, but there's been a lot of work to show that this works quite well. A lot of it led by Chelsea Finn, who's fantastic. The second camp is that you can actually just train a recurrent neural network, which creates its own learning algorithm inside of itself. So at the end of the day, recurrent neural networks are Turing complete. So you train them to do something, and then at inference time, you just like let them go, and there's no SGD at all. They're just within the activations of the network. They're figuring out how to do things such that they absorb information about the world and do better at a certain task. And this is work that was kind of simultaneously pioneered by Jane Wang, who's also fantastic at DeepMind, and RL Squared at the team at OpenAI. And I think the power of this was really shown quite well in the OpenAI Rubik's Cube. It could do wonderful things all based on this style of meta learning. But in the work that I'm going to show you today, we're going to focus on meta learning good initial weights plus SGD, which is the first camp. So this stuff gets pretty technical and pretty detailed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of slowly walk you through how this all works, including introducing a lot of terminology so that I don't lose you through this kind of critical part in the talk. So to slow down a bit, here's how typically MAML would work. Start off with an initial weight vector, theta, and it's initial, so we have this subscript 1 here. And then we're going to start a learning process, an inner loop learning process. So it's going to learn some task, whatever it is. And we're going to take SGD at each step in this task. So these superscripts here are each step of SGD. So you take one step and then a second step, and they're being done from this original theta 1 here. So you get all the way to n steps of SGD. And based on that, starting from the initial weight vector, and then we can evaluate it on that task. Did the robot clean my kitchen, for example? And then I can differentiate all the way back, and this is the magic part, all the way through this blue box, through SGD steps, through these intermediate weight vectors, all the way back to theta 1 here. And I can take the derivative with respect to this loss and say, how should this weight vector, this initial weight vector, have been different or better, such that when I run it through that entire process again, the ultimate downstream loss after n steps of SGD is going to be better. And you can calculate that derivative, use SGD, and therefore take a step from theta 1 to theta 2 to now be a little bit better with respect to that loss. And then you can repeat the process over and over again. And eventually we get to theta m here, which is this highly optimized weight vector that's going to be a good starting place for this whole blue box process. Is everybody still with me? I want to make sure that at least the connection's running.
Yes, I believe so.
Okay.
If maybe I could say this so I understand it, and
Yep.
I don't know, maybe I'll say it wrong, but your idea is essentially you first train a model with some initial weights, and then you get to a final point. And you say, okay, it has some loss X. And then you work your way back to figure out what is a change in your initial weights such that the loss is even lower. And so is that more or less the idea?
Exactly the idea. You captured it perfectly.
Perfect.
Yeah, and I wouldn't have thought before I heard of this stuff that like that initial weight vector would give you enough degrees of freedom to accomplish that end in any meaningful way. But the lesson we've learned in the last few years is that that's not true. You can actually, it's really powerful where you start from. Cool. All right. So that whole process is called meta training. And within meta training, there's these two steps. You on the inner loop, you do what we call meta training. So you're training this network, right? And then you are doing meta training testing. You're evaluating it on the task, right? And then you take a step here. And so it's kind of this axis that we call meta training. And then within each step, you've got these two parts. Now we're going to flip over to meta testing. So we've taken all of these M steps to get a better and better initial weight vector. And now we want to see if it's any good, right? So now we have to go do meta testing to see how well it performs. So we take that final weight, initial weight vector. Sorry, it's a final, yeah, well, it's both final and initial, theta M. And now we're going to test it on a new task. And so because we're doing meta learning, we want to see if it's good at learning, which means we have to test it, giving it something to learn, and then seeing how good it learned that thing. So we start off a new blue box, which starts from, this should be M, theta M here, and it goes for another N steps of SGD, but on some new task. And then we have to see, is it good at that task? So that means we have to go to meta testing, where we do the final evaluation of how good this thing is after learning this task that's here in blue. Does that make sense, Keith?
Yes, I believe so. Yes, thank you.
Okay, cool. All right, so now we have to make it slightly more complicated because we want to do continual learning. So the idea here is that we are, instead of within this blue box, taking n SGD steps on one particular task, now we wanted to learn a sequence of tasks in a row. So during meta training and also during meta testing, what we're going to do is we're going to take whatever the initial weight vector is that starts the process. We're going to take first k steps on one task, then k steps on another task, et cetera, until task t. And then we want to evaluate how good it is. And since we're interested in solving catastrophic forgetting, this test function here will not just test how good it is on this last task t, but on all of the tasks it saw. So this task could be volleyball, this task could be chess, we could have riding a bike, we could have learning Spanish, and then at the end, we evaluate you on how you did on all of them. So if you catastrophically forget, then you're probably only going to be good at this last task here. But if you've learned without forgetting, you'll be good on all of these tasks. And then again, we'll differentiate back through that entire process all the way to this initial vector and create a better vector such that next time we're a little better at knowing all the tasks after training sequentially on them. So with that all in mind, now we can talk about the methods that we're using. So initially, we had actually been working on this vision, meta-learning the solution to catastrophic forgetting, for about a year or more. And things weren't really working that well, and for a variety of design decisions. And then I saw a talk by Martha White on work that her student current Java did with her, and I was really blown away because they got things that worked remarkably well, and they made a lot of different design choices. And we were so inspired by their work that we dropped everything we were doing, and we basically built on top of their work, including inheriting their code base and their experimental design decisions and some algorithmic insights as well. So I want to give them a lot of credit. So their work, called OML, the way that it works is that they're going to take a neural network here, which and they're going to split it in two. And so the neural net is trained to recognize Omniglot images, which is this character, and it has to say that it's like this particular class. And they're going to split the network into what they call the representation learning network, or RLN, and the prediction learning network, or PLN. And what they're going to do is that they're going to meta-learn these networks. And then after meta training, they're going to freeze the blue network. And then when they go to meta testing, they want it to never change these weights here and only do SGD, normal SGD in this red network on top of the features learned in this blue network. And the basic idea was that they're asking meta-learning to create a set of features in this network to go from this image to a feature vector, such that if you do normal SGD on top of those features, then you can learn a variety of tasks sequentially without forgetting. And so the idea was that this feature vector better somehow help this network learn without forgetting. So what they show is that this performs really, really well. So after sequentially training on 150 classes of Omniglot, which is just an absolutely astronomical number for the history of catastrophic forgetting research. I mean, nobody tried to solve 150 tasks in a row, to my knowledge. Usually it was like 5, maybe 10 at the most. They showed that after 150 classes sequentially, it was still really good on all of them, especially in training. So in meta test training, which is to say on the training set that it trained on, it at the end of learning, it had basically near perfect memorization. It memorized everything that it saw. So it could learn even the final examples without forgetting what it memorized about the early examples. And that is, it got 97% of them. However, when you then showed it slightly different versions of those same characters that it just learned, it actually wasn't that good. It got 30%. So it could memorize really well. It could basically memorize without forgetting, but it couldn't learn in a way that would generalize. But still, 63% is still quite impressive. I want to give them tremendous credit. Now, what's really interesting is that it learned a sparse representation all on its own. And this is why I love AI generating algorithms. It's why I love meta learning, because we kind of knew that sparsity probably helps, but we didn't know how to have the system harness that capability. But this thing learned on its own to take advantage of that strategy. So here is, I'll just skip ahead. Here is normal deep learning on the bottom. They call it pre-training. On every instance, so this is one character, this column here. On one character, you can see it's using a lot of neurons. On another character, it's using a lot of other neurons. And on average, you can see it's using, quite a bit of its network. It also interestingly has these dead neurons, which never activate at all. Now, OML, or actually I'll go down here. If you encourage sparsity through an auxiliary function, which is like what historically has been done, then you can see on one instance, it doesn't use much of its network. On a different character, it doesn't use many of these neurons. That's why there's only a few things that are in green, et cetera. But interestingly, on average, what you see is most of the neurons are dead. This is like kind of like the character in movies of a robot that was like too literally did what you asked for and not what you wanted. You asked me to be sparse, so I'm going to almost use no neurons whatsoever. So its performance is hurt by that, and basically a lot of your capacity is wasted. But look what this meta-learning approach did. It's sparse on each instance, but on average, it's using all of its capacity in this really beautiful way. In fact, there are 0 dead neurons here in this network, and its performance is better than these other two. So with that in mind, we thought that OML got a lot right, but we still didn't think that it got everything right because it's still subject to the tyranny of SGD. While at inference time, at meta test training time, this red network, while it's learning, it is trying to learn, it's basically trying to forget, or at least I should say, it doesn't care at all about remembering previous stuff while it's learning the next thing. It's just normal SGD, which is using all the weights to learn whatever is currently in front of its face, right? And so basically you have this war between the blue network and the red network, where the red network is basically, has no incentive to learn without forgetting, and the blue network is basically trying to minimize the damage that the red network can do. And that doesn't feel like the right final solution. It'd be better if the whole system in harmony had learned to learn without forgetting. So that's what we sought to do. So the way that we tried to do this is we wanted meta-learning to be able to control the overall system. And so we do that via this technique that we call neuromodulation. And so traditionally, well, actually, I should take a step back. Neuromodulatory systems are in your brain, in all animal brains, and they're exceedingly complicated. And there's lots of different ways that they work. But one thing that they do, to grossly oversimplify, is that they can turn learning on and off in other parts of the brain. So like one neuron can fire, and it can turn learning on and off elsewhere. And so for decades, people in the neuroevolution community, led by Andrea Soltoggio, have been inspired by that. And they've created these little tiny evolving neural networks where one neuron can fire and it can turn learning on and off in the other neurons in the network. And that worked pretty well on some tasks. It wasn't applied to catastrophic forgetting. So my lab at the University of Wyoming, where I used to be a professor, we looked into this, whether or not this technique would help us with solving catastrophic forgetting. And what we found in a series of 2 papers is with Kai Ellefson and another one led by Robbie Velez, is basically these neuromodulatory networks on with these little neural nets on these very simple problems could perfectly solve catastrophic forgetting. And so our cartoon of this is, imagine if you have a chess detector. It can detect if I'm playing chess, and you have a volleyball detector that detects if I'm playing volleyball. Well, if the chess detector fires, then it could turn learning on only in the chess playing part of the network and nowhere else in the network. And vice versa for volleyball. When I'm learning volleyball, I only learn in that part of the network and I leave all the other weights alone. And that cartoon gives you some insight about how neuromodulation, if done right, could kind of help learn without forgetting, but hopefully in a much bigger, more complicated network. So in this work, we really wanted to scale that up and see if it would help us with deep learning and very big networks that could do sophisticated things. And we worked on that for a while, and that also didn't work. And then Shad had an insight, which is, maybe instead of just affecting learning, we should also be looking at the forward pass. And so the idea here is, imagine if you have the chess playing part of your network and the volleyball playing part of your network, and they're both active every time you're doing either task, and they're trying to like grab your muscles and control your muscles. Well, in reality, you're never going to be good at either of those sports, if you can call chess a sport, games, because your muscles are doing all sorts of crazy things. So the idea here is that we're going to allow neuromodulation to gate the forward pass of the network, to basically like only allow the chess playing part of the network to be active, and that also will indirectly gate the backward pass and where the gradients flow. So we call this activation-based neuromodulation because it's a new form of neuromodulation. And it allows selective activation of the forward pass, and that indirectly allows selective plasticity on the backward pass. Just want to check the time. Okay. So this led to this algorithm that we call a neuromodulated meta-learning algorithm, or ANML. And I'm going to tell you how it works. So what we do is we end up having 2 different neural nets as opposed to just the one. And this red network down here is going to be a completely normal vanilla deep neural net that will learn via SGD. And this second kind of parallel network in blue, which is the neuromodulatory network. And it is going to also get a copy of the data input into it. So on this character is fed into both. And then this network can recognize, what task am I on? What kind of a thing am I doing? Am I playing chess? Am I playing volleyball? In this case, what kind of a character am I looking at? And it will produce an output vector, which we will then do element-wise multiplication to the last layer of the red network here. And this will therefore mask the forward pass. It could basically zero out the activations of some neurons. It could enhance or inhibit other activations, etc. So in normal deep learning, you have inference everywhere in the forward pass, and therefore you have learning everywhere. But in ANML, what we're going to do is we're going to gate this last layer here, which is going to silence some of these neurons. And that means that the forward pass will be interrupted. And also the gradients, therefore, won't flow backwards to neurons, and it'll therefore produce that indirect plasticity. All right, so the domain, as I mentioned, was Omniglot. To show you it a little bit more, each character is a type of task. So this character here is maybe one class. So you have to learn to recognize this thing, and then this thing, and then this thing. And the idea is you only have a few of these characters for each class. So ideally, what we'd like to do is differentiate all the way through 600 tasks, because we wanted to push this 600 tasks, because that's about how many there are in Omniglot, I believe. And that is unfortunately impossible right now. Current meta-learning is not stable enough to differentiate all the way through 600 steps of SGD. And so an approximation that came from OML, which is a really nice insight, is that you can train on the next task, so task T+1, and validate on that task and a random sampling of some previous tasks that you've learned. Which is, I'll say that again. So while you're going through this blue box, you're given some new task. So task 2, for example, and you train on that, and then you see how you did on these tasks, as well as a random sampling of everything you've seen previously. And that is a proxy for, did you learn the new task while remembering all the previous tasks? It's just basically a random subset of the previous things that you've seen. And so you can do that quite well. And that's what we can do for meta training. Cool. So here's this stuff gets complicated, so I want to kind of visualize it for you. So what we're going to do is we're going to, on the inner loop, is we're going to give it a character, take an SGD step, like, you give it a label, you take a step, you do that again and again and again, and eventually you get, maybe you've seen 19 examples. And then what you'll do is we want, after SGD training, now we have to see how good it is. What's its loss for meta training? And the way that we're going to evaluate it is we're going to say, how well do you remember the characters you've just seen? Check its performance on those. And how well do you remember things that you saw previously? And you calculate loss on this, differentiate all the way back through, and then adjust that initial parameter vector to be better next time at going through this process and being better on this question, on this loss. You can then do that with the next character and the next, et cetera, through the thing. In OML, you do that same process, but you freeze the representation and you let normal SGD operate here. And in ANML, you have these two parallel networks. So this network gates the activations of this network. I do want to say that we did find that if during meta testing only, if we freeze this network, then it does actually perform slightly better, but it also worked without that. So that's a bit of a detail, but I wanted to flag it. Okay, so now we go to meta testing. All right, so what do? Now at meta testing, we have our initial weight vector, which in this case is the initial vector of the blue network and the red network. And we are going to train on a new character from Omniglot. We've never seen this character before. And after 20 steps of SGD in the inner loop, we can then say, how good are you on two different things? One, I'm sorry, I said 20. We do 15 steps of SGD on this character. And we've never shown them these. And we say, okay, how good did you do on the test set we did, the training set we just showed you? That is meta test training accuracy. Like, did you memorize these 15 things? And also, how well do you generalize to a few new instances of this class that you've never seen? You've never been given labels before. And that is meta test accuracy, which is right here. So with that in mind, we can then do this process for the second task and then the third task. It's or 200 tasks, however many tasks you want to do, and you get these two different curves. Does everybody understand what these two different curves are? Or does anybody?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right, so now let's see some data. Big build up. Before I get to the data, one final slide, which is I just want to remind you how hard continual learning is and how much harder it is than normal deep learning, normal SGD. So in normal deep learning, you take all of your data, you shuffle it up, and you do IID sampling, on it. And so you don't have catastrophic forgetting because you're not learning things sequentially. It's kind of a random shuffling of all the classes. Additionally, you get multiple passes to that data. And that second step is another distinguishing thing. In sequential learning, you have to deal with the first problem, which is that it's sequential. And then you also only get one pass to the data. So the performance here is going to be lower than you're used to for Omniglot. So here's your first data plot. This is meta test training accuracy. This is how well does it memorize characters that it sees at meta test training. So during meta testing, we're not going to do any meta learning anymore. The weight vectors, we have that final weight vector we want to test, but it still has to learn new things. How well does it memorize the things that we give it labels for? And what you'll see is, first of all, down here, normal deep learning is terrible. This is why catastrophic forgetting is an Achilles heel of the field. If you just do normal deep learning, it falls off a cliff. And around 200 tasks, certainly out to 600, its performance is terrible. It basically only knows the last thing. It does not remember, on average, all of the things that it's seen. OML, which is this orange line here, as you can see, they published their paper at 150 tasks. So their paper was right here. You can see it performs quite well. It remembers almost everything that it saw. But as you stretch it out to 600, it actually starts to do less and less and less well. And it basically can't deal with 600 classes. However, we found a very, very minor tweak to their architecture, which produced this green line here. And so for transparency, we didn't want to beat up on the orange line. We wanted to show that there's this green line exists. And I think what we did was we only froze, we only give it one layer to learn with instead of two. I think that was the tweak. You can check the paper for the details. The point is it performs quite well. And animal is better, but not substantially better, nothing to write home about. However, the real difference is when you look at meta testing accuracy. So this is a function of how well does the network generalize to these new things that it has been shown. So in this case, what you can see is the original OML and even the modified OML really don't do that well as you push out to 600 tasks, but there's this pretty sizable jump all the way up to ANML here, which is not perfect. There's still work to be done, but is surprisingly good, I think, after 600 tasks at performance on these tasks. So there's some interesting Oracle tests you can do. Check the time again. One of them is that you can just shuffle the data to eliminate catastrophic forgetting and see how well do these networks do. And that, if you do that versus sequential training, you can isolate the performance drop that's due specifically to catastrophic forgetting. And so what we found is that, if you only give even normal deep learning one pass, not multiple passes, if you do normal deep learning, when you go from IID to sequential data, you get a 99% performance drop, which is massive. Same thing for transfer learning, where you pre-train all the data you have, and then you fine tune. OML is still dropping quite a bit by this characteristic, but ANML is only dropping 8%, which is quite substantial. So it's really closed most of the gap in terms of catastrophic forgetting. And so the gap that's left is mostly about sample efficiency. Like, it only got to see things once. And so how do we improve things on that front? But it's not really because of the fact that the data is sequential versus shuffled. There's only 8% of an effect there. So I think this is one of the final data slides I have. Just like I showed you before with OML, you can now look at ANML and see that it also learns sparsity. So after the neuromodulatory activation, you can see that on each character, it's got a pretty sparse activation, and overall, it's efficiently using its entire vector. In fact, if you look at it, both OML and ANML have not a single dead neuron, meaning a neuron that never fires for any instance in the training or test set. But whereas you have 14% dead neurons if you have an auxiliary loss for sparsity. So to conclude, ANML can learn 600 sequential tasks and still perform pretty well on average on all 600 tasks at the end of training, which I think is just a real sea change versus work that you saw just a couple of years ago in this area. And it does that because it has this neuromodulatory network that via multiplicative gating can do selective activation. So it can turn certain neurons kind of on and off, it can amplify and inhibit them in the forward pass. And that indirectly allows for selective plasticity in the backward pass in terms of choosing which parts of the network will see learning occur within them. So it can modularize or compartmentalize learning to particular parts of the network. On its own, it learns to produce sparse representations. And what I think is really interesting is it probably is also learning many other strategies, right? Like, if you remember back, I showed you there are many ideas for how to produce solutions to catastrophic forgetting. Many manual techniques were applied. I think it'd be really interesting to try to look into the network and see how many of those strategies we see evidence of in this system. It's learning to do these strategies that we kind of think are good ideas. And also, what things are it doing that we don't know about? And all it's hard science to do. We haven't done that, but it would be really, really interesting for somebody to do that. In future work, obviously, we're still doing this on a very, very simple domain, and we'd like to scale that up. I'd also like to see this style of thing applied to the other family of meta-learning, which is like RL squared, learning to reinforcement learn style. So my overall conclusion slide is that I think both OML and ANML show the promise of meta-learning the solution to catastrophic forgetting. I think this validates the meta-learning philosophy, which is that you should optimize directly for what you want if you can. And I think it's in line with the vision of AI generating algorithms, or AIGAs, which is that we should meta-learn the solution to the hardest challenges in artificial intelligence. And that's what I think is really fun, is to say, how many other machine learning grand challenges can we apply this paradigm to? We could meta-learn to explore safely, to generalize well, to be immune to adversarial examples, to infer causality and solve problems creatively, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So hopefully all the people on this call have their own problems that they might want to apply this sort of approach to. And we're starting to see more and more of that in the community. So overall, ANML increases my confidence that the AI generating algorithm path will be the fastest path to producing truly powerful AI, and will ultimately beat out the manual path to AI. With that, I want to thank my many collaborators whose work I talked about and who in many cases did all of the heavy lifting, and also thank all of you for listening.
Thank you so much, Jeff. This was really, really informative. In fact, if you don't mind, I've actually screenshotted some of these slides and sent them to different researchers who might find this quite useful.
Cool.
And of course we're recording this, and we're going to be sharing that as well. Um, I think we'll have time for, let's say, 2 questions, and I think I have one. Of the questions I have, I think the most pertinent would be, as you know, with something like the no free lunch theorem, it's impossible to generalize on all tasks, but certainly you show that you can do well, at least generalizing to several hundred tasks. So, to what degree does this eventually fail? Will this eventually fail? Or what do you think would be the ultimate limits of something like general AI in that case?
Yeah. So my answer to this is going to be maybe somewhat controversial, but I think it's right. And I think it's that no free lunch should not keep us up at night. I really don't think it has a lot of teeth to it. And the reason is because in practice, we're not trying to solve all possible problems, right? Like I am okay with machine learning algorithms that get really good on all of the problems that exist on Earth and in the universe and the solar system, but do not handle like super weird problems where you're faced with 1 page of white noise and then you have to figure out that you need to like, answer 3, and then on some other thing you have to like, do a backflip, or like these ridiculous problems that have no structure and have no bearing and no physics to them, no geometry, nothing in common with our world. So all of the problems that have ever been solved by humans and animals are a tiny fraction of the sea of all possible problems. And it's true that if you focus on those and you learn priors that help you in this world with the physics we have, with causality and time and space and all this stuff, that you will be worse on some set of arbitrary problems that don't share those priors or share that structure. But that's fine with me. Humans also are amazing, right? We do everything that we do, and yet no free lunch applies to us as much as it applies to AI. And so we are examples that no free lunch should not hold us back in thinking that you can accomplish amazing things in AI.
That's really, really interesting. It kind of reminds me of when I was talking to someone who worked on solving, or I think he was working on solving NP hard problems. We were saying that certain algorithms exist, certain sort of uh, approaches to solving those problems make heuristics that really work well in most cases. They don't work well in all cases, but you can solve these things in near polynomial time for a lot of like special cases, which in practice are the ones that you care about. So in some sense, yeah, that the real world, whether we talk about neural network training or solving NP hard problems, are surprisingly easy. That's a very interesting point. Do others
Agreed.
have any
Amen.
questions about that? Do others have questions? Let's see.
I'm seeing a question in the chat. I could take that, or I'm happy to also take one via voice.
How about by chat? Yeah, I saw. I think Sukhit.
Yeah, I'll start with his question.
Yeah.
So yeah, so his question is, what advice would you have for people starting out with machine learning? I give you 2 pieces of advice. One is, and as Wayne Gretzky liked to say, don't skate to where the puck is, skate to where the puck is going. So keep an eye on the trends. What looks like it's going to be huge in the future. It takes a while to get a paper done. And so, start heading for the trends and the areas and the directions that you really think have legs and are not going to be dead ends. One really kind of cheekish way to say this is like, if you could go back in time 10 years, would you rather work on hog and sift and manual features, or would you rather work on this crazy thing called deep learning that looks like it has a lot of promise because it ultimately will learn all the features, but it might take a lot of computation and take a lot of algorithmic work. Actually, not even a lot of algorithmic work, mostly computation and some hyperparameter tuning to ultimately get it to work in better architectures. So that's one. The second thing I would say is really follow your passions. Science is hard. Every project I've ever been on, including this one, has had a huge slog in the middle. There's like you're in a malaria-infested swamp with your friends. Everybody's hungry. You're starting to think about eating each other. Like it gets really, really, really hard. And if you're not passionate about your project and what you're doing, if you don't wake up saying, I really want to solve this problem, then it's not going to be fun and you're not going to push through those doldrums. And so just like there's so much fascinating thing in machine learning. Find something you're super excited about. And even if it seems hard, or it might, not be exactly the thing that seems easiest, I'd say follow those instincts, because those instincts will pay off, both in terms of maybe you're right and it's an exciting area, but also it'll just help you motivationally, like enjoy the work, even when it's really, really hard.
Thank you again, Jeff.
Thank you.
And with that, I think we're out of time. But I want to thank you again for this talk, and I hope we see you in person sometime.
I would like that. I always like visiting USC. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you.